They laughed at me at my own son's wedding. Laughed like I was nothing more than an inconvenient shadow in their perfect little world. But when her father's eyes locked on mine, the smile slid off his face. He realized too late that I was the one person he could never afford to mock. Welcome back to Her Real Stories, and if you're joining us for the first time, you're about to witness the most ruthless revenge I've ever encountered. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because today's story will show you what happens when people mistake quiet strength for weakness. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and let me know in the comments what you think about what happened next. My name is Lorraine Whitcomb, and I was 73 years old the night of my son's wedding. Today, in my late 70s, people still whisper about what happened that night and what followed after. I'm not flashy, I don't wear designer labels as advertisements, and I've never needed other people's validation to know my worth. But on the day of my son's wedding, I learned that even the people closest to you can see you as nothing more than an inconvenience. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how a mother's love can turn into something far more dangerous when that love gets thrown back in her face. I was 19 when I married Thomas Whitcomb. He was charming, ambitious, and full of promises about the future we'd build together. When our son Michael was born 2 years later, I thought we were living that future. Thomas had other ideas. When Michael was 3, Thomas decided that fatherhood and marriage were cramping his style. He wanted to find himself, which apparently required abandoning his wife and child to pursue a career as a travel photographer. He left on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases and a guitar, promising to send money once he got established. The money never came. The postcards stopped after 6 months. Thomas Whitcomb became nothing more than a signature on divorce papers and a cautionary tale about trusting pretty words from pretty men. I was left with a 3-year-old, no college degree, and $17 in my checking account. Some women might have crumbled. Some might have moved back in with their parents or found another man to solve their problems. But I had something more dangerous than desperation driving me. I had rage. I was angry at Thomas for abandoning us. I was angry at myself for believing his promises. But most of all, I was angry at a world that seemed designed to keep single mothers poor and powerless. So I decided to change the rules. I started with a job at a local oil company, answering phones and filing papers. While Michael was at daycare, I studied everything I could get my hands on. Geological surveys, market analyses, industry reports. While other people went home to dinner and television, I went to night school and earned my business degree one class at a time. I saved every penny I could, living in a tiny apartment and shopping at thrift stores. I learned to see opportunity where other people saw problems. When oil prices crashed in the 80s, I used my small savings to buy up mineral rights that more established companies were abandoning. It turned out those abandoned fields still had plenty of oil in them. They just needed someone willing to use new extraction techniques and take calculated risks. Within 5 years, I owned 3 small oil wells. But the road to that success was paved with battles that taught me everything I'd need to know about dealing with people who underestimated me. The first major test came when I tried to secure financing for my second well. I walked into First National Bank wearing my best dress and carrying a business plan I'd spent months perfecting. The loan officer, a man named Harold Brennan who wore his privilege like expensive cologne, barely glanced at my proposal. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said with a kind of smile that never reached the eyes, "oil speculation is a man's game. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with a small business loan for a hair salon or a boutique." I set my folder on his desk and looked him straight in the eye. "Mr. Brennan, I've done the geological surveys myself. I've studied the market projections and calculated the risk factors. This well will produce and it will be profitable. The question isn't whether I can handle the oil business. The question is whether your bank is smart enough to get in early." He laughed. Actually laughed at me. "I'm sure your husband helped you with those calculations." My ex-husband, I interrupted. Couldn't calculate a restaurant tip without using his fingers. Every number in that folder came from me. I got the loan from a smaller bank across town, whose female president understood what Harold Brennan was too arrogant to see. That well produced for 12 years and paid for my son's entire education. When Harold's bank eventually tried to court my business as I expanded, I reminded him of our first meeting. He'd forgotten it, of course. Men like him forget their casual cruelties because they never consider the impact. I never forgot. And I never let him forget again. By the time I owned a company, I'd learned that success wasn't just about being right or working hard. It was about making sure people remembered the consequences of dismissing you. That lesson would serve me well decades later when facing the Duvals. Michael never asked about my work, and I never volunteered the details. It was easier to let him think of me as just in business, rather than explaining the complex web of acquisitions, mergers, and strategic positioning that made up my empire. He knew I was successful, but he had no idea how far I'd taken it or how many industries I'd quietly conquered. When he started dating Clarissa, this arrangement suited him perfectly. He could acknowledge his mother's financial support without having to explain the source of that wealth to people who might find it unseemly. The transformation of my son didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion of the values I'd tried to instill in him, orchestrated by a woman who saw his potential social value rather than his character. The first dinner I had at the Duval family estate should have been a warning. Eleanor Duval seated me between the teenage daughter of a neighbor and an elderly family friend with hearing problems, while Clarissa held court at the center of a table. When the conversation turned to my work, Michael spoke quickly before I could answer. "Mom's in the oil business," he said, as if that explained everything and nothing. "Very successful, but she likes to keep things low-key." Low-key. As if my achievements were something to whisper about rather than celebrate. Later, when Clarissa gave them a tour of my house, I overheard her commentary in the hallway. "The furniture is so bold, isn't it? Very nouveau riche. And all this modern art, I suppose it's investment pieces rather than actual taste." Michael's response cut deeper than her insult. "She's always been practical about everything. Function over form, you know?" He was apologizing for me. To the woman who would become his wife, he was explaining away my success as some kind of character flaw that needed to be overlooked rather than celebrated. When I confronted him about it later, he seemed genuinely confused by my upset. "I wasn't criticizing you, Mom. I was just helping them understand your style." "My style? You know what I mean. You're not social in the way they are." "There's nothing wrong with that, but Clarissa comes from a different world." "And which world do you want to belong to, Michael?" He couldn't answer that question honestly, which was an answer in itself. That's how he met Clarissa Duval. The Duvals were what people in our city called established wealth. Richard Duval owned a construction and real estate company that his father had started in the 1940s. It was successful but not innovative. Profitable but not growing. The kind of business that survived on reputation and relationships rather than vision or efficiency. Clarissa was their only child, raised to believe that her last name was more valuable than any skill she might develop. She was beautiful in that expensive way that requires professional maintenance, and she had been educated at private schools that taught her how to look down on people with newer money. The first time Michael brought her home, she walked through my house like she was cataloging everything that didn't meet her standards. My furniture was too modern, my art was too bold, my success was too recent and too earned rather than inherited. "Your mother is very intense," I heard her tell Michael in the hallway. "She's had to be," he replied, but there was apology in his voice rather than pride. Over the next 2 years, I watched my son transform himself to fit into Clarissa's world. He started using different vocabulary, shopping at different stores, developing opinions about wine and art that sounded borrowed from magazines. He became a stranger wearing my son's face. When they got engaged, Clarissa made it clear that she expected our family dynamic to change. Michael needs to establish himself as his own man, she explained to me over lunch at a restaurant she'd chosen specifically because the menu had no prices listed. It's important that he not be seen as dependent on family money. Family money that I'd earned by working 18-hour days and making decisions that kept me awake at night. Family money that had paid for Michael's education, his car, his apartment, and the engagement ring he'd used to propose to her. I see, I said carefully. And what role do you envision me playing in your future together? Well, you'll always be his mother, she said with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. But perhaps a more distant role would be appropriate. You understand. I understood perfectly. I was to become a family secret, trotted out for major holidays but otherwise kept at arm's length so my working-class origins didn't contaminate their social climbing. The wedding planning was a masterclass in exclusion, disguised as inclusion. I was asked to pay for things but not to have opinions about them. My name was relegated to the smallest print on invitations. My suggestions were politely ignored while Clarissa's mother's every whim was treated as gospel. It's her day, Michael kept saying whenever I tried to discuss how I was being marginalized. We just want everything to be perfect. Perfect apparently meant pretending I barely existed. But I played along because I loved my son and wanted him to be happy. I wrote checks and kept my mouth shut and told myself that once they were married and settled, things would improve. I should have known better. The wedding was held at the Duval family estate, a sprawling property that had been in their family for 3 generations. The ceremony was beautiful in that expensive, impersonal way that professional wedding planners specialize in creating. I wore a simple silver dress and sat in the 3rd row, behind Clarissa's extended family and college friends. I watched my only child marry a woman who saw me as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a person to be welcomed. During the reception, I did what I always do at social gatherings where I don't quite fit. I found a quiet corner, ordered a glass of good wine, and watched the people who belonged effortlessly navigate conversations I wasn't invited to join. That's when it happened. Clarissa was holding court near the bar, surrounded by her bridesmaids and several family members. Her parents, Richard and Eleanor Duval, were basking in the attention their daughter's beautiful wedding was receiving. Everyone was laughing and toasting and celebrating the union of 2 families. Except they weren't celebrating the union of 2 families. They were celebrating Clarissa's successful acquisition of a husband with convenient access to money, while treating his actual family like an unfortunate side effect. I was standing close enough to hear when one of Clarissa's cousins asked about Michael's people. Oh, you mean his mother? Clarissa's voice carried that particular tone wealthy young women use when they're about to say something cruel, but want it to sound amusing instead of vicious. Yes, where is she? I don't think I've met her. Clarissa turned and pointed directly at me, standing alone by the flower arrangements. This, she announced loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, is the annoying family embarrassment we're stuck with. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed everything I'd been afraid was true. In that moment, I wasn't Lorraine Wickham, successful businesswoman and devoted mother. I was just an embarrassment. A problem to be managed. The laughter that followed was worse than the words themselves. Richard and Eleanor Duval chuckled like their daughter had made a particularly witty observation. The bridesmaids giggled behind their hands. Even some of the other guests who'd overheard smiled at what they assumed was harmless family teasing. I stood there in my silver dress, holding my wine glass, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not break exactly, but crystallize. Harden into something that would never soften again. That's when Richard Duval looked directly at me for the first time all evening. His laughter died in his throat. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as recognition dawned. Wait, he whispered, loud enough that the laughter around him faded into confused silence. Aren't you the billionaire who bought my company last week?" The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a champagne flute hit the ground in the next county. Clarissa's confident smile flickered like a candle in wind. Michael, who had been across the room talking to his college friends, turned toward us with a confused expression. "I'm sorry," Clarissa said, her voice suddenly much smaller. Richard was staring at me like I'd materialized from his worst nightmare. "Wickham Industries," he said, his voice barely audible. "You're L. Wickham. The L. Wickham, who just executed a hostile takeover of Duval Construction." I smiled. Not a warm, forgiving, mother-of-the-groom smile. The kind of smile that appears in boardrooms right before someone's career ends. "Yes," I said simply. "I am." The revelation hit the wedding reception like a bomb going off in slow motion. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as the news rippled outward from our little group. Richard Duval, pillar of the community, had just discovered that his daughter had married the son of the woman who now owned his life's work. But here's what they didn't understand yet. Buying Duval Construction wasn't an accident. It wasn't even primarily about business, although the company was undervalued and ripe for acquisition. It was the opening move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. I had been quietly positioning myself for this moment for over 8 months. Ever since Clarissa made it clear that she saw me as an embarrassment to be hidden away. Ever since my son started apologizing for who I was instead of being proud of what I'd accomplished. The acquisition had been complex and carefully orchestrated. I'd kept every move secret, even from Michael, using shell companies and intermediaries to mask my involvement. Richard Duval was old school in his business practices, which meant he was vulnerable to modern acquisition strategies. His company relied heavily on bank financing for major projects, and when those loans came up for renewal earlier that year, I'd made sure my financial institutions were the ones offering the most attractive refinancing terms. Of course, those terms came with conditions: equity stakes, board positions, operational oversight. By the time Richard realized what was happening, I owned controlling interest in the company his father had built. The beautiful part was that it was all completely legal. Aggressive, perhaps. Ruthless, certainly. But legal. The final paperwork had been signed just days before the wedding, but the groundwork had been laid over months of careful maneuvering. I'd kept my involvement hidden until the last possible moment. The official filings had only gone public 2 days earlier. Richard must have finally seen the name, Wickham, on the legal documents. "You bought my company?" Richard's voice was getting louder now, drawing attention from across the reception hall. "I bought 51% of your company," I corrected. "The other 49% is still yours. For now." Eleanor Duval had gone pale beside her husband. She was a smart woman, and she was beginning to understand the implications of what was happening. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" I looked around at the crowd that was gathering, at my son pushing through the guests to reach us, at Clarissa, whose perfect wedding day was crumbling around her. "Because," I said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "some lessons can only be taught through consequences." Michael reached us just as Richard was beginning to sputter about lawyers and lawsuits and business ethics. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, but his tone was more accusatory than concerned. Even now, even with the truth spreading across his wedding reception like wildfire, his first instinct was to assume I was the one causing problems. What Michael didn't understand was how carefully I'd kept my business moves separate from our family relationship. He knew I was successful, but I deliberately shielded him from the more aggressive aspects of my corporate strategy. The shell companies, the strategic acquisitions, the careful positioning that had made this moment possible, all of it had been invisible to him. "Your mother," Clarissa said, her voice sharp with panic, "apparently bought Daddy's company without telling anyone." "Is that true?" Michael asked me, And I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before.
Fear.
He was afraid of what I might be capable of.
Good.
He should be.
It's true, I said.
I acquired a controlling interest in Duval Construction, I said. The paperwork was finalized just days before the wedding.
But why?
Why would you do something like that without talking to me first? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized he still didn't understand what he'd done. He still thought this was about business decisions and family communication. Because, I said, I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what kind of people you were marrying into. The insult was subtle, but unmistakable. Richard caught it immediately. What kind of people? What's that supposed to mean? It means I wanted to see if you were the kind of people who would mock and humiliate someone at their own child's wedding. It means I wanted to know if you raised the kind of daughter who would call her mother-in-law an embarrassment in front of a room full of strangers. Clarissa's face went from pale to pale again. Around us, the wedding guests were starting to understand that they were witnessing something much more serious than family drama. It also means, I continued, that I now have all the information I need to make my next decisions. What decisions? Eleanor asked, though I could tell she didn't really want to know the answer. I finished my wine and set the glass on the nearest table. When I spoke again, my voice was conversational, almost friendly. Well, for starters, I'll be restructuring Duval Construction's operations to eliminate redundancy and improve efficiency. That will probably mean laying off about 40% of the current workforce and closing the downtown office. Richard looked like he might have a heart attack. You can't do that. Those people have been with the company for decades. I can do whatever I think is best for the company I now own, I replied. I'll also be reviewing all current contracts to ensure they meet our new standards for profitability. Any projects that don't generate sufficient returns will be canceled. Those contracts represent millions of dollars in future revenue, Richard said desperately. Revenue isn't the same as profit, Richard. That's probably why your company was so easy to acquire. The cruelty was precise and calculated. I was dismantling his professional reputation in front of everyone who mattered in his social circle. But I wasn't done. I'll also be conducting a thorough audit of past business practices. You'd be amazed what kinds of irregularities these audits sometimes uncover. The threat was unmistakable. Richard's face went gray as he realized I was essentially holding his entire professional life hostage. Mom, stop. Michael's voice was quiet but urgent. This is my wedding. This is supposed to be a celebration. You're right, I said. This is your wedding. The day you chose to bind yourself to a family that sees fit to mock and humiliate the woman who raised you. I think that's definitely worth celebrating. I turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Clarissa. Oh, and Clarissa? That little boutique you've been planning to open? The one in the Meridian building? I thought you should know that I bought that property this morning. I'm afraid the commercial space won't be available for lease after all. The gasp that escaped her lips was audible across the room. You can't be serious, she whispered. I'm always serious about business, I replied. Just ask your father. I walked out of that reception hall with my head held high and my conscience clear. Behind me, I could hear the explosion of whispers and shocked conversations that would follow me for the rest of the evening. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, I systematically destroyed everything the Duval family had spent 3 generations building. It started with Duval Construction. As promised, I restructured the company from top to bottom. I eliminated positions, canceled contracts, and moved operations to more cost-effective locations. Within 3 months, the proud family business that Richard had inherited from his father was unrecognizable. But the restructuring was just phase 1. Phase 2 involved leveraging my position as majority owner to make Richard's life unbearable. Every decision had to be approved by me. Every expenditure had to be justified in writing. Every client meeting required my representative, to be present. I turned him into an employee in his own company. The psychological effect was devastating. Richard had spent his entire adult life being the boss, the decision-maker, the man whose word was final. Now he was reduced to asking permission for everything from office supplies to vacation time. His health began to deteriorate under the mounting pressure. Eleanor Duval, Clarissa's mother, told their remaining friends that Richard wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly, was drinking too much in the evenings. The stress of watching his life's work be systematically dismantled was eating him alive. Richard had also begun accumulating massive legal bills from his failed attempts to fight my acquisition in court, combined with debt restructuring and personal guarantees on old loans that were suddenly being called in by nervous creditors. Every lawyer he consulted told him the same thing. The takeover had been executed perfectly within legal boundaries. There was nothing he could do to reverse it. But I wasn't finished with the family business. Phase 3 involved the slow, methodical sale of Duval Construction's assets to competitors. The equipment went first, sold to a rival company for below-market prices. Then the contracts, which I transferred to other firms in exchange for favorable terms on future deals. Finally, I sold the Duval Construction name itself to a company in another state. They planned to use it for a landscaping business. Richard watched 60 years of family legacy disappear piece by piece, and there was nothing he could legally do to stop it. I owned the company. I had every right to do with it as I saw fit. Meanwhile, I was working on Clarissa. Her boutique had been her dream, her chance to build something of her own instead of just spending her parents' money. When I bought the building she'd planned to lease, she scrambled to find another location. So I bought that building too. Then the next one. And the next. Within 2 months, I owned every piece of commercial real estate in the shopping district where Clarissa had hoped to establish her business. None of it was available for lease to her. She tried expanding her search to other parts of the city. I expanded my real estate purchases accordingly. The beautiful thing about having serious money is that you can afford to be patient. I didn't need those properties to generate immediate income. I could hold them empty for years if necessary, just to keep Clarissa from achieving her goals. But even after the gala humiliation that destroyed her publicly, I wasn't finished with Clarissa. That spectacular downfall had been satisfying, but I wanted to ensure she could never rebuild. So I tightened the net further. While she was reeling from the social disgrace, I systematically bought up every piece of commercial real estate in the shopping districts where she might attempt to start over. Her boutique dreams had been the one thing that was entirely hers, separate from her family's money or her husband's support. I made sure those dreams stayed buried. The social consequences were swift and devastating, but I wanted Richard to experience his downfall in the most public way possible. The opportunity came at the annual Chamber of Commerce Gala 3 months after the wedding. It was the kind of event where business leaders gathered to celebrate their success and make connections. Richard had attended for 30 years, always seated at one of the head tables, always recognized as a pillar of the community. This year was different. I arrived early and made strategic donations to the charity auction, ensuring my name was announced repeatedly throughout the evening. When the bidding began for a luxury vacation package worth $50,000, I noticed Richard in the crowd, trying to maintain his usual confident presence. He opened the bidding at $10,000. I raised it to $15,000. He countered with $20,000. I smiled and raised my paddle. $25,000. Richard hesitated. His face was already showing strain. Everyone in the room was watching, waiting to see if he'd continue competing with the woman who now owned his life's work. $30,000, he said, his voice tight. $50,000, I replied without pause. The gasp from the audience was audible. Richard stood there, paddle in hand, realizing he couldn't match that bid without bankrupting himself further. He lowered his paddle and sat down heavily. I won the package and donated it back to the charity immediately. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for my generosity, It was recognition of power. Everyone in that room understood that Richard Duval was no longer a player in this community. He left early that night, and I never saw him at another public event. I had my assistants spread carefully crafted whispers about the Duvals' mounting financial troubles. Nothing that could be traced back to me, just strategic conversations in the right ears at the right times. I heard Richard had to let go of half his staff. Eleanor's been selling jewelry. They might have to put the house on the market. In society circles, financial instability is like a disease. Once people suspect you might be struggling, they start avoiding you in case your problems might be contagious. The Duvals found themselves uninvited to events they'd attended for decades. Friends stopped returning their calls. Their country club membership, which had been in the family for 50 years, was quietly allowed to lapse when they couldn't afford the annual dues. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source, their own daughter. Clarissa, faced with the reality that her family name no longer carried the weight it once had, began looking for ways to distance herself from their declining reputation. She started telling people that she'd always known her father's business practices were questionable. She dropped hints that she and Michael were planning to change their last name. She even suggested that perhaps the family's financial troubles were well-deserved consequences for past misdeeds. The betrayal destroyed what was left of Richard and Eleanor's relationship with their daughter. They watched her throw them under the bus to save her own social standing, and something fundamental broke between them. Eleanor called me 6 months after the wedding. Her voice was tired, defeated. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "What will it take for you to stop?" "I want you to understand what you did," I told her. "I want you to know what it feels like to be humiliated by people you trusted. We never meant." "Yes, you did. You laughed. You thought it was funny. You raised a daughter who believes she has the right to mock people she considers beneath her. Now, you're all learning what it feels like to be on the other side of that equation. But this is destroying our family." "Good. Maybe next time you'll think twice before you destroy someone else's." I hung up and went back to planning the next phase of their education. Meanwhile, my relationship with Michael was deteriorating rapidly. He tried reasoning with me first. Long phone calls where he explained how much I was hurting his wife, how unfair it was to punish the whole family for one thoughtless comment, how this wasn't the mother he remembered. "You're right," I told him during one of these conversations. "This isn't the mother you remember. The mother you remember was willing to accept disrespect and humiliation for the sake of family peace. That woman is gone." "But Mom, they didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke." "A joke." "They called me an embarrassment at your wedding, and you're telling me it was just a joke." Clarissa feels terrible about what she said. She wants to apologize. Where was this desire to apologize 6 months ago? Where was it when you were planning your wedding and systematically excluding me from every meaningful decision? Where was it when you stood by and watched your wife treat me like hired help? Michael was quiet for a long time. "I never stood by," he said finally. "I never let anyone treat you badly. You never stood up for me either. When Clarissa made it clear she was ashamed of your family's background, you tried to make yourself more acceptable instead of defending where you came from. When she excluded me from wedding planning, you told me it was her day, and I should understand. When she called me an embarrassment, you worried about how to fix the situation instead of being outraged on my behalf. I just wanted everyone to get along."
"No, Michael."
"You wanted to fit into their world, and you were willing to sacrifice me to do it. The truth of it hung between us like a wall neither of us knew how to climb. When reasoning didn't work, Michael tried anger. He showed up at my house one evening, his face red with frustration and something that looked like panic. "You have to stop this," he said without preamble. "What you're doing to the Duvals, it's not normal. It's not healthy. It's destroying lives." "Whose lives?" asked calmly. "Richard's, for starters. The man is having panic attacks. Eleanor's on antidepressants. Clarissa cries herself to sleep every night. And you think I should care about their emotional well-being? They're family now. They're my family. They made it very clear that I'm not their family. So why should their suffering matter to me? Because you're better than this. Because revenge isn't who you are. I looked at my son, this man I'd loved and sacrificed for and built an empire to support, and realized we were strangers. How would you know who I am? I asked. You've spent the last 5 years trying to turn me into someone else. You've apologized for my success, minimized my accomplishments, and stood by while your wife treated me like an inconvenience. You don't know who I am because you've never bothered to look. That's not true, isn't it? Tell me, Michael, what's my favorite color? He stared at me blankly. What's my favorite book? What's my biggest fear? What's the thing I'm most proud of besides you? The silence stretched between us. You see, I said softly, you don't know me at all. You know the version of me that was useful to you, but you never bothered to learn about the rest. When anger didn't work, Michael tried bargaining. He offered to pay for family therapy. He promised that Clarissa would apologize publicly. He suggested we could all start over if I would just stop the business attacks and let the Duvals rebuild. What about you? I asked. What are you willing to do? Whatever it takes. I'll do whatever you want. I want you to choose. Choose what?
Me or them?
Your mother or your wife's family. The woman who raised you or the people who think she's an embarrassment. I can't choose. They're both important to me. They didn't think I was important when they were laughing at their daughter's joke. You didn't think I was important when you stood by and let it happen. So no, Michael, you don't get to have both. You chose them that night. Now live with the consequences. The final break came 8 months after the wedding. By then, the Duval family was completely destroyed. Richard had suffered a mild heart attack and been forced to retire from what remained of his former company. Eleanor had developed a drinking problem that was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Clarissa had filed for separation from Michael, claiming that the stress of being married to my son was damaging her health. Michael came to see me one last time. She's leaving me, he said without preamble. I know. I heard. Is this what you wanted? Is this how you planned it? I considered lying, but decided he deserved the truth. Yes, I said. This is exactly what I wanted. His face crumpled like he was a child again.
Why?
Why did you want to destroy my marriage? Because it was built on a foundation of disrespect and contempt. Because she married you despite being ashamed of your family, not because she loved all of who you are. Because you let her. I love her. You love the idea of her. You love what she represented. But you don't love someone who thinks your mother is an embarrassment. She made a mistake.
No, Michael.
She revealed who she really was. And you chose to ignore it because acknowledging it would have meant giving up the life you thought you wanted. He sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window at the city skyline. I lost everything, he said finally.
No.
You lost everything you thought you wanted. There's a difference. I lost my wife. My in-laws hate me. My friends are taking sides. My marriage is over. You also lost your illusions. You lost your willingness to compromise your values for social acceptance. You lost your ability to ignore mistreatment of people you claim to love. Those aren't things I wanted to lose. Sometimes we have to lose the wrong things before we can find the right things. He looked at me with something that might have been hope. Does that mean we can fix this? Can we go back to how things used to be? I shook my head. We can't go back, Michael. Too much has been broken. But if you want, we can try to build something new. What would that look like? It would look like you taking responsibility for your choices instead of blaming everyone else for the consequences. It would look like you deciding who you actually are instead of trying to be whoever you think will make other people happy. It would look like you growing up. And if I do that, if I become the person you want me to be, I don't want you to become the person I want you to be. I want you to become the person you want to be, as long as that person has enough self-respect to demand better treatment and enough integrity to give it. The conversation lasted 3 more hours. We talked about things we should have discussed years ago. About the pressure he'd felt to live up to my success, about his shame at our unconventional family structure, about his fear that he wasn't good enough for either world he'd tried to inhabit. By the end of the night, something had shifted between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Not reconciliation, but the possibility of it. Michael left that night with homework. I told him to spend 6 months figuring out who he was when he wasn't trying to impress anyone. To get therapy, find work that meant something to him, and learn to be alone with himself. If he could do those things, I said, maybe we could start rebuilding a relationship based on honesty instead of obligation. Meanwhile, the Duvals continued their spectacular collapse. The divorce between Michael and Clarissa was finalized 10 months after their wedding. She kept her maiden name and moved to another state, claiming she needed a fresh start away from the toxic situation her marriage had created. Richard and Eleanor sold their family estate to pay mounting legal bills and medical expenses. They moved into a modest apartment downtown, the kind of place they would have looked down on a year earlier. Richard never worked again. The stress and humiliation had broken something fundamental in him, and he spent his remaining years as a bitter, defeated man who blamed everyone but himself for his downfall. Eleanor became a cautionary tale in society circles. Other wealthy women would point to her situation and whisper about the importance of treating everyone with respect, because you never knew who might have the power to destroy you. Clarissa tried to rebuild her life in Atlanta, but my reach extended farther than she'd anticipated. When she attempted to open a boutique there, she discovered that certain key properties were no longer available. When she tried to establish herself in new social circles, she found that influential people had already heard unflattering stories about her character. After being frozen out of every business venture and society circle, she finally abandoned her ambitions for status and entrepreneurship. She eventually married a financial advisor 20 years her senior who offered stability rather than excitement. It wasn't the glamorous life she'd planned, but after everything she'd been through, security was enough. She had learned, perhaps too late, that a reputation once destroyed is nearly impossible to rebuild. As for me, I found that revenge was indeed satisfying, but not in the way I'd expected. The satisfaction didn't come from watching the Duvals suffer, though I won't pretend I didn't enjoy seeing justice served. The satisfaction came from finally standing up for myself. From refusing to accept disrespect for the sake of keeping peace. From demonstrating that there are consequences when you mistake someone's kindness for weakness. 5 years have passed since Michael's wedding. He and I meet for lunch once a month, and our relationship is stronger than it's ever been. He's working for a nonprofit organization that provides business mentoring to single mothers, and he seems to have found purpose in helping people who remind him of who I used to be. We don't talk about the Duvals anymore. That chapter of our lives is closed, and we're both focused on writing new chapters that we can be proud of. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in my office overlooking the city I helped build, I think about that wedding reception. I think about the moment when Clarissa pointed at me and called me an embarrassment. I think about the laughter that followed and the look of shock on Richard's face when he realized who I actually was. And I smile. Not because I enjoyed destroying their lives, but because I finally learned to value myself enough to demand better treatment. Because I discovered that I didn't have to accept humiliation for the sake of family harmony. Because I proved that love without respect isn't really love at all. The Duvals taught me a valuable lesson that night, though it wasn't a lesson they intended. They taught me that sometimes the people who seem the most powerful are actually the most vulnerable. They taught me that wealth without wisdom is just a house of cards waiting to fall. They taught me that the only person responsible for defending my dignity is me. I don't regret what I did to them. I don't regret the months of careful planning that led to their destruction. I don't regret using every resource at my disposal to teach them that actions have consequences. What I regret is that it took so long for me to start fighting back. But that's a lesson for another story. For now, I'm content knowing that somewhere out there are people who think twice before they mock strangers. There are people who remember what happened to the Duvals and treat their in-laws with a little more respect. There are people who understand that you never really know who you're dealing with until it's too late to take back your words. And that, I think, makes the world a slightly better place. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what I did to the Duvals. If I think I went too far, if I regret the extent of their destruction. The answer is complicated. Do I feel guilty about defending myself?
No.
Do I regret refusing to accept humiliation for the sake of peace? Absolutely not. Do I wish things could have been resolved differently? Sometimes. But here's what I've learned about revenge. It's not about making other people suffer. It's about refusing to let their actions against you go unanswered. It's about demonstrating that there are consequences for cruelty, even when that cruelty seems small or socially acceptable. The night of Michael's wedding, when Clarissa called me an embarrassment and her family laughed, they thought they were dealing with a harmless old woman who would swallow their insult and move on. They thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak, that my willingness to stay in the background meant I could be pushed around indefinitely. They were wrong. I didn't destroy them because I enjoyed their pain. I destroyed them because they needed to learn that actions have consequences. Because other people needed to see what happens when you mistake kindness for stupidity. Because my son needed to understand that some choices come with a price he wasn't prepared to pay. The Duval family represented everything I despised about inherited privilege, the assumption that money equals worth, the belief that social status gives you the right to look down on others, the casual cruelty that the protected class visits upon those they consider beneath them. They thought their wealth made them untouchable. They thought their social connections would protect them from consequences. They thought wrong. But the most important lesson wasn't the one I taught them. It was the one I taught myself. I learned that I had been complicit in my own mistreatment for years. Every time I accepted a slight for the sake of family harmony, every time I overlooked disrespect to avoid confrontation, every time I allowed myself to be diminished to make other people comfortable, I was teaching them that I didn't value myself enough to demand better. The woman who walked out of that wedding reception was not the same woman who had walked in. The woman who walked in was apologetic, accommodating, willing to be invisible if that's what her family needed. The woman who walked out was done apologizing for taking up space in her own son's life. That transformation was worth everything that followed. 6 months after Clarissa left town, I received a letter from Eleanor Duval. She was living in a senior community by then, her health and finances both diminished by the stress of the previous year. Mrs. Whitcomb, the letter began, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand now what we did to you. I understand why you did what you did to us. I raised my daughter to believe she was better than other people because of circumstances she had nothing to do with creating. I taught her that wealth and social position were more important than character and kindness. I failed her as a mother, and she failed you as a daughter-in-law. I can't undo the damage we've done to each other's families. I can't bring back the businesses or the relationships that were destroyed. But I can tell you that I've learned from this experience, and I'm trying to teach my remaining friends and family to learn from it too. You were right to defend yourself. You were right to demand respect. I only wish we had been wise enough to give it to you before you had to take it. I read that letter 3 times, then filed it away with other important documents. It didn't change anything about what had happened, but it confirmed that the lesson had been learned. 2 years later, Michael remarried. This time, he chose a woman who appreciated his background instead of being ashamed of it. Sarah was a social worker who had grown up in foster care and understood the value of family bonds that were chosen rather than assumed. At their wedding, I sat in the front row. Michael introduced me to Sarah's friends and colleagues as my mother, the most formidable woman I know. When Sarah's mentor asked about my work, Michael spoke proudly about the companies I'd built and the obstacles I'd overcome. During his speech at the reception, Michael talked about the lessons his mother had taught him, about the importance of hard work, the value of integrity, and the necessity of standing up for the people you love. My mom taught me, he said, looking directly at me, that love without respect is just manipulation. That family isn't about blood, it's about commitment. And that some people are worth fighting for, even when that fight is difficult. It was the apology I'd never asked for and the acknowledgement I'd never expected to receive. After the reception, as we were saying goodbye, Sarah pulled me aside. I heard about what happened with Michael's first marriage, she said quietly. I want you to know that I would never treat you the way she did. I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that. You don't have to prove anything to me, I told her. You just have to love my son for who he actually is, not for who you want him to become. That's exactly who I fell in love with, she replied. And I believed her. Today, Michael and Sarah have 2 children, and they bring them to visit me every Sunday for dinner. My grandchildren know stories about their grandmother's business adventures, about the time she bought an entire shopping district just to make a point, about the wedding where she revealed she was more powerful than anyone had imagined. They think I'm somewhat legendary, which is exactly how a grandmother should be perceived by her grandchildren. Michael works for a company that provides microloans to women starting small businesses. He tells me it's the most meaningful work he's ever done, helping other people build the kinds of enterprises that can change their families' futures. We never talk about Clarissa or her family anymore. That chapter of our lives is closed, and we're both committed to writing better chapters going forward. But I keep a photograph on my desk from that first wedding reception. It's a candid shot someone took right after Richard Duvall realized who I was. You can see the exact moment of recognition on his face, the dawning horror as he understood what his daughter had just done. I keep it not because I enjoy their pain, but because I never want to forget the lesson it represents. Never again will I allow people to mistake my kindness for weakness. Never again will I accept disrespect for the sake of keeping peace. Never again will I apologize for being successful, accomplished, or unwilling to be diminished. The Duvalls taught me that some people only understand power. They taught me that there are individuals who will continue to mistreat you until the cost of that mistreatment becomes too high to bear. They taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses. Most importantly, they taught me that I had been underestimating myself for years. I spent decades building companies, making deals, and wielding influence in boardrooms full of men who tried to minimize my contributions. But somehow, when it came to my personal life, I forgot that I had power. I forgot that I didn't have to accept whatever treatment people decided to give me. The woman who attended Michael's first wedding was successful, but apologetic. Wealthy, but self-effacing. Powerful, but unwilling to use that power to defend herself. The woman who orchestrated the Duvalls' destruction was all of those things plus something more, unapologetic about her worth. That transformation was the most valuable thing to come out of the entire experience. Now, when young women contact me for business advice, I tell them about the importance of building professional skills and financial independence. But I also tell them about the importance of setting boundaries and demanding respect. Success without self-respect is just expensive misery, I tell them. Don't ever let anyone convince you that being kind means accepting mistreatment. Some of them think I'm too harsh, too unforgiving. They believe that family relationships should be preserved at all costs, that forgiveness is always the noble choice, that revenge is beneath successful people. I understand that perspective. I held it myself for many years. But I also understand now that there's a difference between forgiveness and enabling. There's a difference between keeping peace and keeping quiet while people abuse your generosity. The Duvals didn't need my forgiveness. They needed consequences. They needed to understand that their actions had real costs for real people. They needed to learn that cruelty, even socially acceptable cruelty, doesn't happen in a vacuum. And they learned. Richard Duval spent his final years as a broken man, but he also spent them as a wiser man. He never spoke publicly about what happened between our families, but people who knew him said he became much more careful about how he treated service workers, much more respectful of people from different backgrounds, much more aware of how his words and actions affected others. Eleanor became an advocate for treating in-laws with kindness and respect. She gave talks at women's clubs about the importance of building bridges instead of walls within families. She never mentioned me specifically, but everyone knew what experience had inspired her new perspective. Even Clarissa, in her own way, learned from the experience. Her second marriage was reportedly much more grounded, much less about social climbing and much more about genuine partnership. She never again made the mistake of dismissing someone based on their background or appearance. The ripple effects of that one night extended far beyond our immediate families. Other people in our social circles became more careful about how they treated the relatives of their friends and colleagues. Wedding planners started advising brides to be more inclusive of their new family members. Society pages began writing about the importance of graciousness and respect in family relationships. The story of Michael's wedding became a cautionary tale that people told to illustrate the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their perceived social status. And I became something I'd never expected to be, a symbol of what happens when you push the wrong person too far. That reputation has served me well in business. People approach negotiations with me differently now, with a healthy respect for what I'm capable of when properly motivated. They've learned that I'm reasonable and fair, but that there are lines they shouldn't cross. The fear some people have of me isn't based on cruelty or vindictiveness. It's based on understanding that I will protect myself and the people I care about, and that I have the resources and determination to make that protection meaningful. That's not something I'm ashamed of. That's something I'm proud of. The world is full of people who mistake kindness for weakness, who see generosity as an invitation to take advantage, who interpret patience as permission to push boundaries. Those people need to understand that there are consequences for their behavior. I'm happy to be the person who teaches them that lesson. Today, 5 years after Michael's first wedding, I can honestly say that standing up to the Duval family was one of the most important things I've ever done. Not because their suffering brought me joy, but because refusing to accept their disrespect changed everything about how I moved through the world. I'm no longer the woman who apologizes for taking up space. I'm no longer the mother who accepts disrespect for the sake of family harmony. I'm no longer the businesswoman who's successful in the boardroom but apologetic in the living room. I'm Lorraine Whitcomb, and I know exactly what I'm worth. That knowledge has made me a better mother, a better businesswoman, and a better person. It's allowed me to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenient arrangements based on what I can provide for other people. Most importantly, it's allowed me to model something different for my grandchildren. They're growing up with a grandmother who stands up for herself, who demands to be treated with dignity, who refuses to accept less than she deserves. When they're older and facing their own challenges with difficult people, I hope they'll remember their grandmother's example. I hope they'll understand that defending yourself isn't selfish or vindictive. It's necessary. I hope they'll never have to learn the hard way, like I did, that the cost of accepting mistreatment is always higher than the cost of standing up for yourself. But if they do find themselves in a situation like the one I faced at Michael's wedding, I hope they'll remember that they have choices. That they don't have to smile and swallow insults for the sake of keeping peace. That they have the right to demand respect, even from family members. And if respect isn't freely given, I hope they'll have the courage to take it. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, but respect. Not destruction, but dignity. Not cruelty, but the refusal to accept cruelty from others. The Duvals thought they could laugh at me, dismiss me, treat me like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be respected. They thought wrong. And everyone who witnessed what happened to them learned a valuable lesson about the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of their perceived position in the social hierarchy. That lesson has made the world a little bit kinder, a little bit more respectful, a little bit more aware that you never really know who you're dealing with or what they're capable of when pushed too far. And that, I think, is a legacy worth being proud of. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who think you'll never fight back. They see your kindness and mistake it for weakness. They see your patience and assume it means you'll accept anything. But what happens when the woman they dismissed finally stops accepting their treatment? What happens when she reveals that she's been powerful all along, just choosing not to use that power against them? You get justice.
You get respect.
You get people who think twice before they mock someone they don't understand. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you get a son who finally learns to be proud of the mother who raised him. If this resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a story, and comment below about a time when someone underestimated you. I read every comment, and your stories inspire me. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.